Hello everybody, it's my distinct honor to introduce the Honorable Mr. Cisneros to our Rotary LA5. Mr. Cisneros' community building career began at local level. After serving 3 terms as a city council member in 1981, Mr. Cisneros became the first Hispanic American mayor of San Antonio, Texas. During his 4 terms as mayor, he helped rebuild the city's economic base and spurred the creation of jobs through massive infrastructure and downtown improvements. In 1984, Mr. Cisneros was interviewed by a Democratic presidential nominee as a possible candidate for Vice President of the United States. After leaving HUD in 1997, Mr. Cisneros was President and Chief Operating Officer of Univision. Today, Mr. Cisneros is Chairman of the CityView companies, which work with urban home builders to create home prices within the range of average families. CityView is a partner in building more than 60 communities in 13 states, incorporating more than 7,000 homes with home value over $2 billion. He is currently a member of advisory boards of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Broad Foundation. Mr. Cisneros has also been author or editor of several books, including his work with former HUD Secretary Mr. Jack Kemp, Opportunity and Progress, a bipartisan platform for national housing policy, which was presenting the Common Purpose Award for demonstrating the potential of bipartisan cooperation. His latest book is Independent for Life, which advocates for homes and neighbors for an aging America. Mr. Cisneros holds a Bachelor of Arts and Master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning from Texas A&M University. He earned a Master's degree in Public Administration from Harvard University. Studied urban economics at MIT, holds a doctorate in Public Administration from George Washington University, and has been awarded more than 20 honorary doctorates from leading universities. He served as an infantry officer in the United States Army. Mr. Cisneros is married with 3 children and 4 grandchildren. I'm honored to know Mr. Cisneros personally, and I cannot think of an individual more charismatic and passionate in all he does. And he's a hardworking man of action, with decades-long track record of delivering of his promises. Bienvenido, Mr. Cisneros.
Simone, thank you very, very, very much. Before anything else, as Simone mentioned, I have the good fortune today of having my wife present, Mary Alice Cisneros, who has served on the City Council in San Antonio, helped select the house that we bought here in Los Angeles in 1997, and has spent the last 2 weeks out here dealing with a granddaughter who broke her leg playing soccer. So we're well established in Los Angeles, my wife. President Jay, you may preside over the 5th oldest Rotary Club in the country, but it is the most enthusiastic Rotary Club I've had the privilege of encountering. Everyone comes to this microphone and it projects, and you have so many different activities underway. I've had the good fortune over the years of presenting before many Rotaries, including the one in San Antonio, and I must say this is a very, very enthusiastic group. Every interaction I've had from Paul St. John, who helped me focus on the subject that he wanted today, and of course Simone. Simone, who has already shown she could draw more guests than anyone. And Simone, whose background, including heritage in China as well as Brazil, is exactly the kind of person that Los Angeles is attracting today, as it has become a magnet for talent from all over the world. We have great affection in our family for Los Angeles. My interactions with Los Angeles go back to the days of Mayor Bradley in the Olympics when I was mayor of San Antonio, and then the unfortunate period around the disturbances in South Central when he asked me to come out and try to be helpful, and I did. And I have to tell you that my experiences then, which I was later able to relay to candidate Bill Clinton, are part of the reason why I ended up in the President's Cabinet as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And then I made many, many trips out here to Los Angeles, including the Northridge earthquake. When I joined Univision in 1997, we bought a home in a place called Bel Air Crest, just off the 405, across from Mountain Gate. And Mary Alice found the house, and we own it even now. My daughter and son-in-law live in it, and we maintain a home nearby. So we have deep affection for Los Angeles, always, except when the Spurs play the Clippers or the Lakers. And you can understand why I might have a conflict on those nights. Paul St. John asked me to speak about housing. My topic assigned today is housing in the present market and where it's going. So let me begin just by asserting for you the importance of housing to people in our country, to our economy, to the nation's progress. We have not had an economic recovery since the end of World War II, the various cycles of economic upturns and downturns, that didn't include a major recovery of the housing sector. One could argue that the joblessness, if you will, the flatness of the current recovery is in part because the housing sector has not recovered. In good times, housing can be as much as 15% of GDP when we think in terms of not just construction, but housing finance and appliances, transportation, materials, the entire range of industries that supports housing. I noticed yesterday that as the Federal Reserve issued its Beige Book quarterly report, that they indicated that the increasing pace of the recovery is in part due to the increasing health of the housing sector. This is what the report said, quote, residential real estate markets strengthened in nearly all districts, that's Federal Reserve districts, and home prices rose amid falling inventories across much of the country. Well, that's a lot to say in one sentence. Residential real estate markets strengthened, home prices rose, in part because of falling inventories, meaning that the stock of housing is being absorbed, and as it is, prices are rising. That's all good for the country and for the recovery. Housing is also very important to individual families, not just to the economy generally. The Demos Institute in New York tells us that since the end of World War II, the attributes in the American economy that have contributed to the middle class and its strengthening, its growth, are three. One, access to higher education, the GI Bill after World War II, minimum wage strategies in the 50s and 60s that held wages on a growing course, and thirdly, access to home ownership. Because for most families, the sum total of their net worth, what we call wealth, is the equity that they have in their home. And it's the difference between really owning nothing and owning something in the American system. And of course, home ownership translates itself in the capacity to borrow on that equity or cash in on that equity. But it's a major economic proposition for most people in our country. But the truth of the matter is that as much as these things are important, the real importance of housing is what it means to families. Housing is the place where we raise our children. It's the place where we pray. It's a place where we store and cook our food. It's a place where we find safety from the dangers of the world. It's a place where we learn and teach our children. It's a place where we gather to celebrate happy times, where we find solace in sad times. It's a place where we can show off our artistic side, where we find shelter from the elements. It's a place where we keep our precious possessions, where we heal when we are sick. It's a place where we can be ourselves, when we can argue for what we want, a place where we love with all our hearts, It's a place where we get our start in life as babies, and it's a place where we grow old. So at its core, it's a lot more than four walls. It's a lot more than an economic proposition. Home is a sacred place. And I listened to David speak about the St. Vincent de Paul Society and talk about homeless. One of the ways you really appreciate what home is when you see people who have to live without a home. Those who are homeless have told me stories. I've spent the night as HUD secretary in homeless shelters and talked to people about what it means to be unsafe on the streets. One lady talked to me about sleeping in a park and having someone come by while she slept and kick her in the face, and knocked out her teeth, for example. People who are on the streets and sick have a decidedly shorter life expectancy than people who can care for themselves in a safe and warm and dry place. I encountered some of that sense the night of January 17th, 1994. I'll remember it forever, when the earthquake occurred in Northridge at 4:36 in the morning. I was on a television program because it was Martin Luther King Day in Washington, and I was on a CBS program when I heard on the feed in my ear that something had just happened. It was 7:36 in the morning Washington time, 4:36 out here. I called the president at the White House, tell him that something severe had just occurred in Los Angeles, and he said, well, get the relevant cabinet members to come over to the White House. We're having a Martin Luther King event later, and I want to talk about this. By 2 o'clock, we were on an airplane en route to Los Angeles and landed that evening. As HUD secretary, I was briefed and told there were 20,000 people living outside, stuck outside their homes. The police had put yellow tape around the houses because as the earthquake had occurred in the Northridge area, they were afraid that even though they might be only partially damaged in the first earthquake, the subsequent tremors would hurt people. So 20,000 people were living in the parks, under tarps, in cars, and soon we got them into tents and National Guard armories and schools. But 2 or 3 weeks into that, it was very clear, as Mr. Shaw reminded me earlier, he was president of the Apartment Association in those days, these were just not places where people could live. Imagine having to leave your house at 4:36 in the morning in a rush, without your medicines, without your papers, without keys, without bank accounts, without children's homework, without work papers, without clothing, and having to live that way for a month or so. That's what it was that people encountered. So the point I'm trying to make is that housing is important. It's important to our country. It's important in people's lives. I've just finished serving on a national commission hosted by the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington that focuses on what housing should look like after the turndown. What should the shape of our housing system be? And it concluded 3 things. We didn't do a map that designs the whole housing sector, but we did talk about 3 major policy issues. And I'll recite them for you very quickly. The first is the reorganization, the re-energization, if you will, of the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac securitization process. Now, I know that this is not a subject that's first on your interest, but let me say it is very important because without the ability to securitize mortgages, that is to say, take mortgages from the retail institutions, from bank and mortgage companies, package them and sell them into the international markets, as we've done for 30 years, there wouldn't be the ability to create liquidity. That is to say, bring capital back so that those retail institutions can keep lending. But there's a general consensus that the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac model has broken down. They were hybrid institutions that went far off mission, began to behave like Wall Street institutions, and as a result contributed to the breakdown. So this commission is recommending a strategy that will continue to bring credit into the housing market, but not the hybrid that was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. By all accounts, those will go out of existence, and a new system that has more private capital in it and less government. So the taxpayers are not on the hook they were in this last round, is what we believe will be the process going forward. The second major set of recommendations of this commission dealt with the balance between policies that support home ownership and policies that support rental. Now, we all support home ownership for the reasons that I described earlier. It has been a national commitment, and particularly since 1949, when President Truman signed the 1949 Housing Act that said a safe, decent home for every American is a national goal. But the truth of the matter is we've gotten far out of balance in the amount of money we spend as a country on encouraging home ownership as against the need for rental, which is more in tune with our demographics today. We spend twice as much, like $90 billion annually, on encouraging home ownership through the mortgage interest deduction, for example. It's not an expenditure, but it's what's called a tax expenditure. It's money that doesn't come into the tax system. We're foregoing that revenue as a country versus something about half of that in rental. And the truth of the matter is that we've gotten not only out of balance, but many Americans are more likely to be renters in the years going forward. We have more immigrants in our population who are not going to be homeowners immediately. Some time will pass. We have young professionals who are moving to homeownership later than ever in their careers because of the difficulty in finding jobs right out of college. So this commission is recommending some balance. Now, the mortgage interest deduction is the third rail in housing in America. No one dares touch it. But it has gotten out of hand in some respects, in that it was created for first-time home buyers for a primary home. Now it applies to secondary homes. Now it applies to a lake home. Now it applies to boats. Now it applies to HELOCs, to home equity loans. So some reining in the context of tax reform, the great debate that's yet to occur. We have to get through the sequestration and the fiscal cliff and all of these other things before we get to tax reform. But when the tax reform debate starts, the mortgage interest deduction, or some nipping of it, some nipping and tucking, is going to be on the table. And when that happens, we hope that a greater proportion of the revenues can be put in the column that says assisting renters. Now, the third theme that I want to share with you from that report is the changing demographics of the country. Two different things. One, the aging of our traditional population, and the other, the rise of immigrants. First of all, aging. Today we have 40 million people in the country over 65 years of age. In about 30 years, that number will be 80 million. Doubling the number of 65-year-olds in the country. Today we have 6 million people over 85 years of age. In 30 years, that will be 20 million, a tripling of the number over 85. Only a small percentage of that number will be in nursing homes or other institutional care. Most of the folks want to live on their own and will live on their own. So the question is, how do we begin to think about how do we provide age-appropriate, independent living for people who are much older? We're going to have people living a good deal longer, and many, many, many more of them. The baby boomers, last year, the first baby boomer, actually a year and a half, 2011, reached 65 years of age. They were born in 1946. They reached 65. That was 1.8 million people. The number is about 70 million over 18 years who will reach 65 years of age. We're seeing a gray wave like the country has never seen before. And how we provide either a new stock of more age-appropriate housing, or, very importantly, and I think this is going to be one of the big issues of our time, how do we re-accessorize the existing housing stock for people who want to stay in the house that they're in? How do we remove stairways and create zero step entrances? And how do we lower bathroom fixtures so people can use them? And how do we lower kitchen cabinets and change to levers so a frailer wrist can handle the turns? And how do we put in lighting that people can get up in the middle of the night without falling and hurting themselves and ending up in the hospital? But all of these practical things. I participated in a project that Stanford had about a year ago on this subject, and every time I have spoken on that subject in depth, describing to people the things that we can do and should do, it resonates with the audience, because so many people are having this exact discussion in their families about how do they keep aging parents who want to remain in their homes. And it's actually important that they remain in their homes for their peace of mind, for the way they want to live. And it saves the country immensely if we're able to keep people in their homes for a much longer time than go to some sort of expensive institutional care. There's a theory that a professor at Stanford has articulated called compression of morbidity. And the idea is the normal graph of frailty and decline begins around 55, and we think of it as a steady decline. What he says is you can keep that line flat for a very long time and have only the period of morbidity, of serious problems, very near toward the end. It's hugely important to people, individuals, and to families, and we can do that. And having people live safely in their own home is one of the tools that we can use to get there. The second aspect of the demographics is immigrants. The foreign-born population. Just yesterday, USC demographers published a report for the Mortgage Bankers Association. And here's what they said. From 2000 to 2010, immigrants, who are 13% of the nation's population, were 39% of the nation's growth in home ownership. So immigrants are becoming homeowners. Now, this is very, very important, because we've always needed a group to fuel the growth of the housing markets. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, it was the post-World War II group. Later, in the 70s and 80s, it was the baby boomers. Now we have this immigrant population that is 39% today, and promises to stay in that range. 39%, almost 40% of all of the growth in householders looking for homes are immigrants. In California, that number is 82%. 82% of the purchasers of homes are immigrants. In New York, it's 65%. In Texas, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Ohio, and Michigan, it's substantial, and even in places which you don't think of as immigrant destinations. In Georgia, 34% of the buyers. In North Carolina, 25% of the buyers. Now, those immigrants are of all ethnic groups. And I must say, I think Asian Americans are among the most active buyers, because they do very well economically and then want to sign on to the American dream. But the Hispanic population is growing as well. The population of Hispanics who came here in the 1980s, who bought homes, was 15% in 1990. 15%. By 2010, it was 53%. And by 2020, it'll be 61% of that group will be in the market or have bought homes. So the idea you get that I'm presenting here is that home ownership has to be thought of in some different ways. It's not just the house in the suburbs, as we've always thought, but tailoring our thinking to ensure this older population is addressed and this immigrant population is addressed. Well, let me wind down my remarks so we can take a few questions, because I really look forward to hearing your questions on just sharing some brief thoughts on housing in Los Angeles. Obviously, there needs to be more rental stock at affordable prices, because a great city needs a mix of housing types. When people have to live too far from the employment centers, everybody suffers. The workers who travel long distances. Our office, my office presently in Los Angeles, is on Wilshire. Before that, we were in Santa Monica. And I used to talk to some of our workforce, and they described having to come from as far as San Bernardino and Riverside to work because it's the only place they could afford housing and make it into the metropolitan area. So the rental stock is very important. It will also be important to restock some of Los Angeles' neighborhoods with what's called the new urbanism. Urban, walkable neighborhoods where young professionals can buy. Transit-oriented, a big theme in Los Angeles' future with the extension of the mass transit system. The land around subway stations, the land around train stations, I should say, or even bus routes is hugely valuable and has great commercial potential to be developed. Obviously, housing downtown. There's some very, very good trends. Developers stepping up and building downtown, but with the new attractions downtown, LA5, the Disney facility, the new Broad Museum, and others downtown, more people will want to live downtown, and providing a core that's walkable and livable and exciting, stimulating urban life will be important in Los Angeles. Energy sustainable housing. This is a land of sun, and a lot can be done with solar energy to retrofit existing apartment buildings, and the city is working in that direction. And then finally, two categories of housing that I think will be important in Los Angeles' future. One is student housing. My company, CityView, has had great success with a student housing project near USC on Figueroa, 2700 Figueroa, which is not sponsored by the university. It's a private venture, and yet it was sold out before it was open because of the need for USC rethinking itself as from a commuting school to a destination for not only young people from every one of the 50 states, but from countries abroad. And parents want to make sure that they have good quality and safe living environments. And so the USC plan calls for more housing of that type around USC. Education, higher education, is a big business in Los Angeles. And providing good quality housing for the students will be an important part of that. And finally, as I mentioned, senior alternatives as well, of all kinds, as the population ages, and we try to provide decent, dignified, and affordable housing for a senior population. So, though generally housing is a subject that when you mention the name, people begin to nod off. You've been very courteous. I see a lot of faces. Only a few nodding off. Though it's generally thought of as a subject that puts people to sleep, in fact, it's very important at multiple levels. Important to our economy, important to our cities, important to our families, important to the idea of America as we know it, where people can invest in their...
So, you're willing to take
sure.
some questions?
Yeah.
So, if you'll please wait for the microphone. I see our Sergeant-at-Arms going around the room. Let's start actually over here. I think Olympia, please ask your question.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation today. I was one of the individuals in the Northridge earthquake.
Yes.
At 4:31 in the morning, there was an earthquake, and my sisters and I escaped the collapsing building. And we're very fortunate because one of my class members died. And it was very, very difficult because at that moment in time, I lost everything I owned. But the good news is I was 17, so I didn't own much. But in any case, what kept me through is the fact that I still had the ability to gain and earn my bachelor's degree in mathematics and later my master's degree in mathematics. So that was something that allowed me to push through the tragedy and go for that degree. So I echo what you were saying, which is the higher education actually contributes the most to the economy. My question for you is this. How does your organization work with, let's say, FEMA or other organizations? So when catastrophes like that occur in the future, the people who have have been displaced will have a home again?
My company, and I didn't want to say much about it because I didn't want this to be an advertisement for a private company, but I'm the chairman of a company called CityView, which I founded in 2000, which aggregates institutional capital, like CalPERS and Los Angeles Retirement System and Texas teachers and Illinois teachers. They all have investment programs. And we convert their investments into returns in housing. That is to say, we build housing across the country with that investment capital. So we are not in the public business, we're not in the government subsidy business, we build market homes, but in urban areas. Our focus is in cities. Now, having said that, our company was just awarded, along with a New York partner, a $200 million commitment to build housing in New York after Hurricane Sandy. So we're going to be building in the destroyed areas where Sandy actually had impact, and in the surrounding neighborhoods to shore up those neighborhoods. With their $200 million, we will invest as equity in partnerships to build housing, and the result will be to shore up those neighborhoods. So while we're officially, not in the disaster recovery business, we can be helpful in cases like that, and it is an important way to use capital that if we manage it properly, will generate returns and enhance those retirement systems and the pensioners that are part of it. I want to make sure I get Mr. Shaw over here because I promised him earlier I would take a question, but we'll come here first.
Go with, Dave,
right.
President Dave first, and then we'll get a mic over here, please.
Okay.
Mr. Secretary, thanks a lot. Having a daughter at USC and a Gateway project, I can understand student housing needs, so thank you for that.
Gateway is a project just across from USC, just down the street from us, which opened before us.
Yes, right.
Right. And this is a question if you're able to comment, reference the FHFA and your comments on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and housing. Could you comment, or do you have knowledge on what the phantom housing situation is that we hear about? That there's still a lot of foreclosure of houses in the pipeline is creating some shortage of housing availability for sale, or if you know of or can comment.
Well, the shadow housing stock has been an immense problem for the country. The fact that the banks had foreclosed on the amount that they did, and then unlike in previous cases in the 1980s and the savings and loans crisis and others, the banks simply didn't put it out. It was held out there, and so that's where the word shadow came from. No one knew exactly what the price was, but it was the competition to builders wanting to build new stock. So builders basically held back because they didn't know how much there was out there. They didn't know when it was going to be released on the market, and they didn't know what the price would be. So the real competition for builders was not other builders, as is normally the case. It was the shadow stock. And as a result, they just kept their powder dry for a very, very long time. I would say there's a lot of aspects of this recovery that we did not handle well as a country. And the worst of it was in the housing sector. We overcompensated in terms of credit and lending so that people cannot get credit for mortgages in many, many places. Down payment requirements are way up. And as a result, people are not able to buy who ordinarily would. Now, granted, we went too far, and it's part of what got us into trouble. But the compensation, the pendulum has swung so far that housing is slow in recovering, and as a result, the national recovery has been flat because housing plays that important role. My sense now, to answer your question, is that the banks have found ways to begin to put stock out. I see a lot of evidence that that's happening. And most of the estimates I've seen show that a good deal, a high percentage of the foreclosed stock is moving through the system, and builders are returning to the marketplace now. Construction levels will be up, employment levels will be up as the housing sector comes back to the table. Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. I don't think you've been adequately thanked, and I don't think most people know why in Los Angeles during the earthquake we did not suffer as they have in Sandy and in New Orleans. And a large part of the reason that we didn't, a large part of the reason that we were able to deal with those issues so promptly was because of this man, Secretary Cisneros. I was president of the Apartment Association, and I was confronted with city officials with 25,000 people that couldn't be put in housing. Secretary Cisneros arrived. He called a small group of people together. I was one of them. We made suggestions, and he implemented them. And he implemented them instantly because of his strong relationship with the president, because of his vast knowledge of the types of problems we dealt with. And as a consequence, we recovered from that much more quickly than we would have. And I want to take this opportunity to thank you for what you did.
The microphone to you.
You can settle up with me afterwards. But the question is, the Wall Street Journal article yesterday seemed to take a position that was contrary to what it seemed to indicate was your position. And I have such a high regard for you. Yeah. I would like you to comment on that.
There's a fellow named Peter Wallison who works at, I think, American Enterprise Institute, maybe it's a Cato Institute. It's one of the conservative think tanks who takes the position that the government should not be involved in securitization at all. It's really, there's three kind of positions. One is it ought to be the government doing it all. Then there is the government should not be involved at all. And then there is this kind of middle ground that we've staked out. And here's the issue. If the government is not involved at all, then the private sector runs the securitization process. It ends up costing more, so we lose some ability to do mortgages at reasonable rates. In other words, people are going to end up with multiple percentage points, right, for mortgage transactions. Number two, when the inevitable recessions do occur, and they're a regular reoccurrence in American society, the private sector withdraws, and there's nothing to shore up the system. There's nothing to continue bringing capital in, like Fannie and Freddie did in the apartment sector, particularly during this recession. And thirdly, and most importantly, the 30-year mortgage, fixed-rate mortgage, is the hardest mortgage for the private sector to do, but it's the most important to people. Mm-hmm. So if we create a system where you can't get a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, we're going to take a whole lot of people out of the homeownership equation. So those are the three reasons why we feel there needs to be what we're calling a government guarantee or insurance program. Not the government involved directly, but a small fee attached to every transaction that goes into a fund so that if we ever get into a position where we need catastrophic involvement, it's not the taxpayer, but it's that fund that's able to step in. So that's the Peter Wallison argument versus the one that this commission has taken.
Thank you.
We've got time for one last question. Gary Higgins.
Largely because of the high cost of housing in California.
Correct.
My girlfriend is encouraging me to look at investment outside of California, and specifically in Texas, and even more specifically in Dallas. From an investment perspective, from your point of view, good idea, bad idea.
Investment advice.
Well, San Antonio. The only thing I could say is better than Dallas is San Antonio. Now, here's what I would say. Texas is awash in housing, and it's because there are low barriers to entry. So it's not the best investment because you're not going to get the price appreciation because it's easy to reproduce. Okay? So as a strict economic proposition, I mean, we need the housing, and I'd love to see more of it, but as a strict economic proposition, it's not where you're going to get the greatest return on an investment. Now, my own contention, and we're building a lot in California, is that because there are barriers to entry, because it is scarce, you can command a price appreciation And you just have to choose carefully where you do it. We have found at CityView that our strategy of building in the cities, we're building something called the Barker Block over here. Some of you may know where that is. The old Barker Furniture Company. And it's the best-selling project in downtown Los Angeles, lofts downtown. Right? We also are involved in a project called Tennessee Lofts on off Olympic. Another one called Glencoe in the marina. And multiples in the San Fernando Valley. And they have been smashing economic successes. So if you pick right and have a strategy, you can make money in California and in housing people in California. And Lord knows it's going to continue to be needed going forward. Anywhere you build on the coasts, yes. Boston, New York, Washington, through Charlotte, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. We're doing land office business in San Francisco. Beautiful projects in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Los Angeles, San Diego is hard to build in. They don't have hardly any land in the city that you can aggregate anymore. But this is a bi-coastal nation now. And you just almost can't go wrong in building housing for a growing nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hate to say this, but as a fellow Texan and from Houston, I'm actually from the Tri-Coast. In honor of your presentation today, Friday, March 8th, a $1,000 donation has been made in your name to LA5's Scholarship Fund to help disadvantaged youth in LA through LA.